There can be little doubt, I think, that the two 19th century philosophers who have had the widest influence outside philosophy are Marx and Nietzsche. In continental Europe especially, the influence of Nietzsche on philosophers since his day has been prodigious. But he's also influenced creative writers, including some of the most eminent in the English language. For instance, Bernard Shaw, W.B. Yeats, and D.H. Lawrence. The quality of his own prose is simply dazzling and is second to nobody's. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in Saxony in 1844. He had an academic career of extraordinary brilliance as a classic scholar and became a full professor in his mid-20s, an almost unheard-of thing. But then he threw over his university career, went into isolation and became a philosopher. For 16 years he poured out his writings, mostly either short books or books of essays and aphorisms. Some of the best-known titles are The Birth of Tragedy, Human All Too Human, The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, and, most famous of all, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. At first he was deeply influenced by the ideas of Schopenhauer and Wagner, but he rebelled against both and went on to produce some notorious anti-Wagner polemics. Until the last 4 years of his creative life, he made no attempt to build a system of any kind. But then he began to think of drawing all his main themes together into one single comprehensive work, first to be called The Will to Power, then The Revaluation of All Values. But it was not to be. Always plagued by ill health, in January 1889 he collapsed into mental illness, a condition almost certainly caused by tertiary syphilis, and he was helplessly insane until his death in 1900. With me to discuss his work is J.P. Stern, Professor of German in the University of London and author of one of the best known of the many books on Nietzsche. Professor Stern, I think one can say that Nietzsche was the first philosopher really to face up to Western man's loss of faith in religion, loss of belief in God or in the existence of any world outside this one. And if there's no God and no transcendental world, then all values, all truth, rationality, standards of any kind are not given to man from some agency outside himself, but are created by man, presumably for his own needs. We choose our values, or at least we create our values. Now, this is an extraordinarily disruptive and disturbing thing to confront, and Nietzsche knew that. Can we start the story from there?
Yes, I think that this is a perfectly fair way of starting. In addition to what you said about his life, I think one might mention that he was a son of the man's, that he himself had, his father was a minister of the Lutheran Church, and therefore his attack on Christianity is not a neutral, not a disinterested, not a pacific thing at all, but is violent, dramatic, melodramatic in many ways. It's an attack on Christianity rather than on Christ. And I think the point that you made, that he envisages 19th century man to have to stand on his own feet without the support of faith or dogma of any kind, is central, is a central kind of starting point to his philosophy. I think we want to see him as somebody who does not simply profess a flat kind of atheism, but who is personally, intimately involved in the denial of divine justice and divine mercy and all that.
But this Nietzschean starting point did launch him, didn't it, into a revaluation of all values,
yes.
to use the title of his book. I mean, one thing he was saying was that, in a way, we are basing our lives on false premises because we adopt attitudes and values and standards which, when we actually examine the premises of them, we reject those premises, the old traditional premises.
What he believed in, what he tried to show, was that the whole edifice, both of Christian values and of idealism, which he saw derivative from those values, was false, had to be thrown over, and something else to be put in its stead. The question as to what was to be put in its stead is not quite so simple, but that was the basic premise from which he began, and that, I think, makes for the melodrama, the extraordinary melodrama of the person, of the style, of the whole phenomenon of Nietzsche.
Now, this revaluation of all values is, of course, a colossal task, and I think it'll make our discussion of it clearer if we divide our consideration of it up a little bit.
Yes.
There are four main traditions within Western civilization to which Nietzsche addressed himself and which he attacked. The tradition of Christian morality, the tradition of secular morality, the herd values, as he called them, the ordinary morality of the mass of mankind, and some, at least, of the traditions deriving from ancient Greece, particularly
that's right,
from Socrates. Now, let's have a look at each of those four in turn. Can you say a little bit more about his fundamental criticism of Christian values?
Well, I think to say, to start with, on the Christian, I think the attack is a very simple one, a very straightforward one. All the positive values of Christianity, turning the other cheek, loving your neighbor as you love yourself, having compassion for those suffering, all these are ruled out of court. Now, not absolutely, because, as we shall see later, I think, I want to make that point very clearly, Nietzsche is constantly making special rules for special people, and he is very much against the notion of generalizing simply rules in the way in which Kant had done in the categorical imperative. So, yes, the first thing, then, is the attack not on Christ, but on Christianity as really furthering the underdog, furthering the person who cannot stand on his own feet and requires compassion, requires pity, illicitly requires sympathy from the outside.
But why was he against compassion and against pity? Why did he despise those so much?
He's not against them. He does not despise them when they come from the strong person. What he despises is the support of the weak person from outside himself. Whatever that source is, the outside source may be, whether it's another person, his compassion, or rules or regulations, laws, or whatever.
And the reason for being against this was what?
The reason for being against it was his fundamental appeal is to authenticity, to selfhood, to the élan vital, to the life within the person lived to the full.
Yeah. Now, what about his criticism of secular morality? I mean, the great moral philosophers like Kant, or in his own day, the utilitarians and so on, that wasn't Christian morality quite, but he was against that too.
Yes.
Now, why?
I think the main reason there is this, that all systems of secular moralities are based on an abstraction from the individual case. They're based on an appeal to a generality. For Nietzsche, the word general is the same as common, and by common he means common in the nasty sense of the word. And therefore, in a sense, all rules and regulations, one might almost go as far as saying all laws, are for him matters for the common herd and no more. And now we're, of course, already on the third point that you made, the point about the common herd.
Yeah.
He's most emphatically not a democratic philosopher. He's a philosopher of the great and the noble people, the heroic kind of philosophy, and therefore for him the appeal of democratic ideology is very, very low indeed.
He thought that the noble man, the great man, the hero, should be a law unto himself and shouldn't be hamstrung by
precisely.
the petty rules and regulations and so on.
That's the best phrase you can use, a law unto himself.
Yes.
It's not the sentence he used, but it's very, very precise what he meant.
Now, what about the last of the four traditions that I mentioned, that of ancient Greece? It's worth remembering in this context that he did start adult life as a classic scholar, a professor of classics. He knew about ancient Greece and became deeply critical, didn't he, of the whole tradition deriving from Socrates.
Yes, but his classical work, and I think it's one of the most remarkable works ever written on the whole problem of tragedy, is concerned with pre-Socratic Greece, with pre-Socratic tragedy, which for him is a kind of golden age. And the whole thing goes flat at the point when Euripides, Aristophanes, and Socrates come on the scene. What happens there is that strength and goodwill and warmth and beauty are replaced by reason, are replaced by rationalizing things, by the Socratic argy-bargy. He never forgave Plato, so to speak, for bringing up a hero whose main qualities are those of talking everybody else into the ground.
Now, this concern with the origins of culture, which he displayed in such a rich way, one has to say, was all bound up with his notion that we make our values.
Yes.
Because if human values and human culture are made by us and not given to us by God or authority outside ourselves, then the whole question of how we get them, where they come from, becomes a fundamental one for him, doesn't it?
Yes.
And it's also a fundamental 19th century concern, the whole concern with origins.
Yes.
One thinks of the origin of species, Darwinism, and so on. Was Nietzsche influenced by Darwin?
Yes, well, he certainly was anti-Darwinian, and I think the idea is that he didn't really understand very clearly what the whole theory of the origin of the species came to. Like so many 19th century figures, he was always going to study physiology, going to study chemistry, going to study physics, but never got round to it. So I don't think that there's an awful lot of interesting things to be said about his attitude to that. But I think the main point about origins is that, again, like some philosophers, like Marx, for instance, he believes that you can determine the quality of the product by the nature and quality of the origin. This, after all, is very much what Freud did, and I suspect that Freud got it very largely from Nietzsche, although he isn't very ready to acknowledge it. Now, what that means is really that the background, the genealogy of morals, for instance, you quoted one of the titles, is in fact indicative of the quality of morals. Now, let me say I don't believe this is true, but, I mean, that is very much the 19th century view over and over again, that you can determine the quality of a mental product by the nature, by the origin that is at the back of it.
Yes, and we are now inclined sometimes to call that the genetic fallacy.
That's
but
right.
I don't want to go into that.
Yes, I think it's very close, yes.
Your mention of Freud prompts another question that I wanted to put to you. This program of re-evaluating values and seeing values as something that we create to meet our needs led Nietzsche to a psychological analysis of values in terms of both individual and social needs, didn't it?
That is perfectly true.
It becomes an essentially psychological
It is
inquiry.
a way of psychologizing a lot of phenomena. This is perfectly correct. And indeed, I think he was a very remarkable psychologist in many ways, and he does not produce a system either in psychology or in anything else, and in that sense he's different from Freud, but he's very, very similar, in fact very much of an antecedent to Freud, because he places a very great deal of emphasis upon the unconscious. There is a myth about to the effect that Freud invented the unconscious. Nothing could be further from the truth. The unconscious has been about since the end of the 18th century, and Nietzsche is one of those who used the term and put tremendous emphasis on it. But he does not have a layer theory of the self the way that Freud did. As I say, he is very, very much less systematic. He distrusts systems. He thinks there's something indecent about trying to encapsulate a human being, a human psyche, within a systematic account.
Another aspect of that is his notion that different moralities are appropriate for different people.
Yes.
Which he certainly had, didn't he? I mean, wouldn't it be true to say, well, in fact, you have said it, I think, that he distrusted rules. He thought they hamstrung the strong, they limited the creative.
Yes. He does believe that individual people are entitled to individual kinds of behavior and to individual bits of knowledge. This is the most astonishing thing, and also I think in many ways very prophetic kind of thing, that he believed that knowledge was not absolute, that the acquisition, the pursuit of knowledge was not to be taken absolutely, but that a given civilization had its own particular entitlement to the kind of knowledge that it could bear. You see, the emphasis is on it could bear it. He did envisage situations where knowledge would destroy the knower.
Our knowledge of nuclear fission, for example, has become a lethal threat to us.
Precisely.
And that is something that Nietzsche would very easily and very well have understood.
Yes, and he did in fact say so. I mean, not about nuclear physics, of course, but about knowledge generally. You see, we only have really one other theory of knowledge apart from our own. Our own is that all knowledge is worth pursuing regardless, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, the other one is the Soviet idea, which goes on and which simply creates a system by which knowledge is socially useful and then pursued and not pursued if it's not socially useful. Nietzsche's view is somewhat similar to this. He does believe that given civilizations can destroy themselves, and the ground on which all this is erected is, in fact, we're coming back now to Socrates, the Socratic yen for knowledge, this endless, this driving force which pushes us on.
Up to this point in our discussion, we've talked about Nietzsche's critical enterprise.
Yes.
This basic view that up to this point in our history, the morals and values and standards of Western man have all been historically based on belief in a god or in gods who gave us these values, gave us these moral standards and so on, and would judge us by our failure to live up to them or success in living up to them and so on. Now, he comes along and he says, we've lost belief in God, we've lost belief in religion. That means we've lost belief in the whole foundation of our value system. And if we're to have a valid value system, we've got to re-evaluate it and refound it from the bottom up. And we've talked of some of the various critiques, individual critiques, into which this led him. I now want us to move on from this to the next stage of the discussion. And in a sense, it's the obvious question to ask. What were his positive values, having, as it were, swept everything away on a colossal scale? What is he now advocating that we put in its place?
Well, the answer to that is a very simple and a very complicated one, both at the same time. The simple answer is be yourself at the top of everything that you are, to the hilt. Live your life fully, live it adventurously, and all the other things which later on come under the heading of élan vital, that in the human sphere, I mean, that essentially the be thou thyself is the major premise from which he begins, and it's also the goal towards which ethics ought to be directed. Now, you may ask, of course, if everybody is himself and himself alone, how is this to be done in a wider sphere? How is this to be done in a political system, and so on? The answers to that question are, I'm afraid, very unsatisfactory as far as he's concerned, as indeed his whole attitude towards social questions never does get very far. Now, I said also that this is very, very complicated precisely for this reason, because it makes living together in some kind of harmony extremely difficult if you add to this the view that laws are, after all, there simply to make things easy for the weak person. You can see there's not very much purchase to be got out of that either. So it is, on the face of it, a simple system, but basically I think there is a great deal of difficulty facing anyone who's going to put this forward. In a sense, I think we can say that some of the fascist politics of the early part of the century is based, to some extent, among the intellectuals at any rate, on this view that you must create your own values. Well, it hasn't got us very far, as you can see.
But this notion that you must say, as he put it, say yes to life, affirm life, be untrammeled, to the top of your bent, uninhibited, also led him to the view that, of course, this is going to lead you into conflict with other people, but you must simply sweep them aside. You must sweep away the weak and the unable and all those who, as it were, get in your way. That, of course, is absolutely flat head-on in conflict with Christian morality, isn't it?
Yes, it has, but then you see, you've only mentioned one half of it. The other part of it is you must also conquer all that is comfortable, all that is cowardly, all that is less than adventurous within yourself. And if you've done that, that is the view that he puts forward in Zarathustra, for instance, if you've done that, you won't really want to be so very aggressive towards the others. You will have some understanding of their weaknesses, though the understanding of the positive, the tolerant understanding of weaknesses is not precisely Nietzsche's very strong point.
Not what he's most famous for.
Yes.
I mean, people, of course, have always been shocked by his saying this, and they've thought that what he was advocating was contrary to moral standards and so on. But his point, of course, was that that, in fact, moral standards ought to be derived from life,
Yes.
ought to be subordinate to life.
Yes.
That our notions of truth and rationality and all the rest
Yes.
ought to derive from life assertion.
Yes,
And
or
life-
from the great man.
Yes.
From the great man, and by the great man he meant, as I already mentioned, Goethe would be one, Napoleon would be another, sometimes Luther, sometimes even some of the great Borgia popes would figure as that, and sometimes even Socrates would, because he had the strength of mind to carry through his own project.
But this supremacy of life assertion and
Yes.
self-assertion
Yes.
means that even truth itself must be subjugated to this.
Absolutely.
If there are truths that
Yes.
would damage us, that
Yes.
in other words would
Yes.
damage our lives,
Yes.
then we don't want to know
Yes.
them.
You see, we're back again at the question of the entitlement to truth, or at what he once called the hygiene of knowledge. There ought to be some kind of hygiene that would tell us what kind of knowledge we may face and what kind of knowledge we should reject. And you're quite right, that truth itself, in that way, is subjected to this kind of embargo, to this kind of sanction that he puts forward.
Well, one sees absolutely how this is flat contrary to all moralities that have actually existed. Would it be true to say that Nietzsche's defense, if he deigned to defend himself
Yes.
against criticism,
Yes.
would have been to say something like this? But look, the whole of civilization, humanity itself, if you like, the whole evolutionary process, has consisted of the strong eliminating the weak, the able eliminating the unable, the intelligent eliminating the stupid. And it's only because these processes have gone on perpetually over millions of years that we have any civilization at all, that we have any humanity at all. These things have created
Yes.
value.
Yes, I think that is precisely what he says, and what he would say on a number of occasions, different contexts, and his worry about the future is precisely that this kind of thing will not go on, that the democratic spirit, the spirit of the plebs, of the rabblement will take over and will annihilate all these values.
That it will put into reverse the very process that has actually created civilization out of barbarism.
Yes. But in addition to that, I think we have to bear in mind that he has a view of history which is really rather different from the view on which your analysis was based. He sees history as repeating itself. Now, what that means, we shall talk about that a little later, but what it essentially means is this, that any historical situation can create and absorb and make use of the highest that man is capable of creating. There aren't any privileged situations. There are no privileged eras. And therefore, any era that sees itself as capable of fully understanding, of fully creating these values, should be allowed to do that. And the trouble is that the late 19th century, the early 20th century, may very well be what he calls eras of decadence, in which this strength cannot be fully realized.
Now, your mention of his doctrine that history repeats itself brings me to what I would like to think of as the next stage in our discussion. When one comes to regard Nietzsche's later work, there are four big themes in it, and again, I think for clarity's sake, it will help if we take them one at a time.
Yes.
One is what you might summarize under the phrase, the will to power, a phrase which he has popularized. One is the Übermensch, or translated as the Superman, again, an invention of his that's entered our language. One is this doctrine you mentioned of the eternal recurrence of time. And the fourth, I would say, is his notion of the aesthetic understanding of life.
Yes.
Now, let's deal with those in order. Let's talk first about the will to power, which at one time he was going to give as a title to the summation of his life's work.
Yes.
What was this notion of his, of the will to power?
Well, he takes the notion of the will from your own special philosopher Schopenhauer, of course, and he reverses the evaluation of that, where Schopenhauer regarded the will as the source of all evil in the world and as the source of man's unhappiness. He regards it as the strength of man's strength, the source of man's strength, and the cultivation, the permission to the will to enact what it can enact is part of a healthy culture. Now, the difficulty there, I think, is that this obviously brings you in conflict with other people, and therefore at this stage the will to power becomes a will to self-assertion, a will to usurpation of the other. But that's not all there is to the will. I think it's to be emphasized, not overemphasized, as some critics have done, but to be emphasized, that the will to power also turns itself inward, that is to say, it destroys within the self all that is weak, all that is comfortable, all that is simply, part of a man's self-indulgence.
A kind of drastic bringing of oneself up to the mark, as it were.
Up to the mark, which one has created oneself, and this is the difficult
one's
thing
created
about
the mark.
Yes, the mark
yes.
oneself. That's right. Yes.
Well, now let's move on
Yes.
then to the next of the four main themes of his later work,
Yes.
the Superman. Now,
Yes.
everybody knows the word
Yes.
Superman, and it was in fact Nietzsche who
Yes.
invented it.
Yes.
It's been a very much misunderstood concept. People have
Yes.
associated it with the blonde beast of Hitlerian mythology
Yes.
and Nazi caricature.
Yes. Yes.
Of course, that's not what he meant at all,
No,
was it?
I think that is not what he meant at all. I think the Superman is the man, the production, I mean, who can be produced by any civilization. Remember I said that any era is capable of bringing forth the maximum values that men are capable of. Superman is the man who lives all that the will to power will secure for him, lives it to the full, is capable of repeating his own willing ad infinitum. We're already arriving at the doctrine, at the most controversial of all the things, the most bizarre, if you like, of these views, the eternal recurrence.
Yes, let's get there quite
No.
yet, because I want
Yes.
to unpack this
Yes.
notion of the Superman,
Yes.
which has played such an enormous role in
Yes.
the thought in the last
Yes.
100 years,
Yes.
and been so abused and misused
Yes.
by the Nazis,
Yes.
for example. Wouldn't it be truer to say that what Nietzsche was actually trying to get at was the notion of an unrepressed man?
Yes.
In, if you like, the Freudian sense,
Yes.
a man who has re-evaluated his
Yes.
values,
Yes.
who is not living his life according to false values, who is being to the top of his bent
Yes.
in an
Yes.
uninhibited,
Yes.
untrammeled, free spirit
Yes.
way.
Yes.
Isn't that rather
Yes,
the
I think
notion
that
of
is
the
so.
Superman?
And but it would be a man who, without, as it were, restricting himself, would naturally, instinctively, not do any of the things that Nietzsche regards as evil. For instance, the one category that he comes out unequivocally in his system is grudgingness, is what he calls ressentiment, is the grudgingness, the grudging admission of warmth, the grudging admission of success, and all these kind of things. Now, the Superman is one who naturally does not feel any of these things. You know the story.
It's the generous spirit.
It is a generous spirit, yes. And there again you see the whole notion of the Christian generous spirit is not all that far from Nietzsche's purview.
Now let us move on to the third of our
Yes.
four main themes, and you've touched on it already,
Yes.
this notion of the eternal recurrence.
Yes.
Now, I would say that, if anything, of all the doctrines of Nietzsche, this is the hardest, not just for people to understand, but even to take seriously.
Yes.
I mean, on the face of it, he appears to be saying that the whole of history moves in epicycles, vast epicycles,
Yes.
so that everything comes round again,
Yes.
and again, and again, forever.
Yes.
So that you and I have actually sat in this studio having this conversation unnumberable times before, and will do so unnumberable times
Yes.
again. Now,
Yes.
is he really saying that?
Well, he's really saying that, and he is trying out what might happen if you took that view seriously. And I think we want to say altogether, in our whole discussion, that a great deal of his thinking is of this experimental kind. And by that I don't mean that it's not serious, I don't mean that it is not responsible, I don't mean that it is trivial, but I do mean that here's somebody who's facing the whole of human thought and is trying to make some sort of shift with almost any area in it, and is trying out again and again different views. There's a saying of his, I think a very tragic saying of his, in a letter where he writes, I feel as though I were a pen, a new pen, a quill presumably, being tried out by some superior power on a bit of paper. It's a very strange thing to be feeling for somebody who's advocating the will to power and the Superman, and yet I think he did genuinely feel that. Now, he does then try out this thought, and it seems to me not so much a theory of being, not so much a theory of the cosmos, it seems to me a moral theory. That is to say, our actions, our willing, our intentions, our thoughts should be of such a superior kind, of such a grand kind, have such generosity and grandness about them, that we should not flinch to and be able to be willing to repeat them over and over again, ad nauseam, ad infinitum.
So in other words, you're really only saying yes to life,
yes,
embracing life,
yes,
as he always says we should, if you would be willing to do it over and over again.
That's
what
right.
you're doing
That's
now,
right. Yes.
and only ever
Yes.
this.
Yes. I think to go on very much further than that and try to produce geometrical or mathematical equations in order to prove either the possibility or the impossibility of these views, which has been tried, has been done, doesn't seem to me to be terribly sensible.
That's the point. In other words, it's a huge metaphor.
Really. It is a huge metaphor, and of course a great deal must be said about Nietzsche's uses of metaphors.
Well, say just something about it, because it's very relevant at this point.
I think I think we are in the habit of taking things literally in a way in which doesn't make sense as far as a great many of his statements are concerned. You spoke to begin with about his grand style, and I think it is an extraordinarily powerful, effective style. If I ask myself where it derives from, I think it derives from a strange invention, a strange discovery he seems to have made of placing his discourse, his language, somewhere halfway between metaphor and literal meaning. And this is something which very, very few people, certainly very few German writers, have done before him. He stands entirely on his own as far as thinking is concerned. You have mentioned that, and we've seen how he attacks every tradition in the West. Where he does find his precursors is in the style. And Montaigne and Pascal and La Rochefoucauld are his favorite authors, and that whole aphoristic style, I think, derives a tremendous lot from them, and it's not only me saying it, it's himself saying it. And this style, which is pitched halfway between metaphor and literal statement, is something quite extraordinary, and I think unless we understand it for what it is, we are going to misread him. I have a quotation which I think gives an example of what I have in mind. When he talked about the terrible deprivation that he felt 19th century people experienced through what he called luridly the death of God, he wrote as follows. He says, rather than cope with the unbearable loneliness of their condition, men will continue to seek their shattered God, and for his sake they will love the very serpents that dwell among his ruins. Now you see this mixture of, on the one hand, conceptual thinking, I mean loneliness and condition, are abstract terms belonging to conceptual thought. On the other hand, you've got the serpents glistening somewhere through the ruins of the shattered God. Well, that, and the refusal, I think, to go beyond that, in other words, to write out the theory behind the metaphors, I think essentially constitutes what he's about.
And it does give us, the readers, a problem. This mix, this fusion of poetry and metaphor on the one hand with concepts, hard concepts on the other, gives us a problem about how to take him. And that's really implicit in what you've just been saying. This leads to the fourth of the four themes of the later philosophy. We've talked now briefly about the will to power, about the Superman, and about his doctrine of the eternal recurrence of time. What you've just been saying about his use of metaphor leads us to the fourth of the four main themes in the later work, which is his notion that life is to be understood aesthetically.
Yes.
And I suppose the point here is that if there's nothing outside this world, no God, no transcendent realm or anything, then any meaning or justification that life has must be meaning derived from inside itself.
Yes.
So that, like a work of art, I mean, the only meaning a work of art has is what it, so to speak, gives itself. I mean, it doesn't derive its meaning from outside. Is that...
well, that certainly is a very fair way of coming close to what he's after. In the very first of his books, The Birth of, the Birth of Tragedy, he uses this phrase 3 times. It's only as an aesthetic phenomenon that the being of man and the world are eternally justified. It's a very complicated sentence, and I don't think I want to go into all the details of it, but what he's saying essentially is this. The greatness of the early Greeks, of the pre-Socratics, lay in their tragedy. Their tragedy was a way of facing the worst aspects of human life, that is, its transitoriness, its impermanence, its corruptness, its dependence upon forces greater than yourself, and to make of these a major tale, a story, a wonderful tragedy. And this he applies in the largest, in the most cosmic possible sense. And he's asking, as indeed I think Shakespeare did occasionally, he's asking, is the whole world really to be taken seriously, or is it not a great game, a great play, some kind of drama played out by we do not know who, and if there is to be a justification, mind you, justification is the phrase he uses, which is a very dicey word to use in this context, because, of course, it's a judicial phrase, isn't it? Yeah. But if there is a justification for man being here and being what he is, maybe it is simply as part of this huge cosmic drama. And a great deal of his thought, and I think of some of his most interesting and greatest thought, goes precisely into rehearsing and trying to make sense of this aesthetic justification of man.
Now, you're talking about the way metaphor and aesthetic considerations are fused into the very substance of the thought itself. And you spoke very interestingly a moment or two ago about his actual style and the tradition to which it related. It in its turn has had immense influence, hasn't it? I instance some of the great creative writers that he has influenced in my introduction to this program. Now, your particular field of expertise, if I may say so, is known to be comparative literature. It would be extremely interesting, I think, to end this discussion with just a word or two from you about the way Nietzsche and his writing and his philosophy have influenced creative writers since him.
Well, simply to take the 3 names that you yourself mentioned, W.B. Yeats is the first one. Yeats read Nietzsche for the first time in a very brief little excerpts, translated by a man called John Common, of all things. It seems to me a most inappropriate name for a translator of Nietzsche. And from 1902 onwards, when he read him, I think there is a very clear change in the general tenor and in the attitude of Yeats's poetry, and that slightly sultry, slightly sentimental, Yellow Roses kind of poetry of fin de siècle Yeats changes very much, and the great poetry, which is the poetry, as Yeats himself calls it, the poetry of blood and mire, I think is very strongly influenced by his reading of Nietzsche, by his attempts to grasp some of the problems that we discussed earlier on. With Shaw, the influence is a very, very different one. It is very much in the biological sphere. It is in the sphere of that élan vital which I mentioned. It is in the sphere of the ruthless life, the life that justifies itself. With D.H. Lawrence, I think, again, it is the question of authenticity. Now, the authenticity, as Lawrence conceives, it's a very different kind of authenticity from the one that Nietzsche had in mind. In other words, it's social and sexual, and of course both of these are really rather minor factors in Nietzsche, but it is certainly from Nietzsche, through his wife, Frieda Lawrence, that he acquired some knowledge of Nietzsche and that he was deeply influenced by it. And a very late and I think rather dreadful Christ story of Lawrence's seems to me to derive straight out of Nietzsche's psychologizing of the Christ figure. If we look on the continent, of course, Pirandello, Thomas Mann, André Malraux, all these people not only have been very strongly under his influence, but they acknowledge the influence throughout. Strindberg had a long correspondence through a common friend with Nietzsche, and so on. I think that there are immensely powerful influences, but we have to bear in mind that the aphoristic style, the tremendous attractiveness of the metaphors, the brevity of the message, and literary persons don't like to read heavy books, they like to read aphorisms, all these play very much into Nietzsche's hand.
One last question, Professor Stern. I don't think we can finish our discussion without touching on it. If you say the name Nietzsche to most educated people in the West nowadays, what they immediately think of is the Nazis. And the Nazis seem to have appropriated Nietzsche as their philosopher in the same sort of way as they appropriated Wagner as their composer. And that's had the effect ever since of contaminating the reputation of those two geniuses in the minds of large numbers of people. Now, is it fair or is it unfair to associate Nietzsche with fascism?
I think he must be associated with it to some extent, and fascism rather than National Socialism. It was Mussolini who read him extensively, who received a copy of the collected works from the Führer on the Brenner in 1938 as a present. Hitler himself, I think, probably knew phrases, certainly knew phrases like the will to power, but hadn't read anything of his. I think in some ways this is a justifiable charge, and I would put it this way, that to the extent that these parties depended upon their intellectuals, and to the extent that the intellectuals depended upon some sort of more or less ill-assorted ideology, Nietzsche was part of it. But of course, at the same time, I think it's to be emphasized very strongly, there are lots of things in him, much more important things in him, which are absolute anathema to these people, to these gangsters, let's put it quite plainly, and self-control, and the inward struggle of the self, and the attainment of valid, of generosity, for instance, and greatness of the kind that we have described, have nothing whatever to do with the kind of murderous ideologies that came into being in the Third Reich and among the early on among the Italians.
And it's quite plain from the fact that you yourself have devoted so much of your life to studying Nietzsche and writing about him, that you think this is a hugely valuable undertaking, nevertheless.
Yes, I certainly think it is an immensely valuable undertaking, providing we do not go to it with some expectation of getting a panacea on how to live right, but provided we go to it with a view to finding out what human beings can do, what the human possibility is, what the being of man is capable of understanding and creating from within itself.
Thank you very much, Professor Stern.
Thank you. I enjoyed myself very much.